So here we are at the start of the Vintage Marathon, but before we begin, I think it apt to point out how Vintage differs from the other formats and specifically what sets it apart. So the major thing is going to be how Vintage has most all cards in Magic's history legal. Now that's not entirely true. There are still some banned cards, but for the most part, pretty much every card is legal regardless of power level, although Vintage has what's known as its restricted list. So cards on the restricted list can only be played as one-ofs in a deck. It's basically the equivalent of banning, but since all cards must be legal, you can temper down the maximum power cards to just one copy. So cards like Ancestral Recall, Black Lotus, Library of Alexandria, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, the Moxes, of course, various tutors like Mystical, Demonic, Vampiric, Necropotent, Time Twister, Strip Mine, Soul Ring, Time Vault, Time Walk, Tinker, and Tolarian Academy being some of the best ones. Now, of course, just because most cards are legal doesn't mean they all are, and here are some of the notable exceptions. So some cards that are banned are things that are not legal in traditional competitive formats, so silver border cards or conspiracies from Conspiracy Draft. Of course, ante is not legal, so any gambling type ante cards are banned. Any sort of manual dexterity stuff like Chaos Orb or Falling Star that require taking physical actions involving dexterity of any kind. And of course, cards like Shahrazad that just create lengthy, pointless subgames. So these are banned, but otherwise, the most powerful cards like Black Lotus are not banned, but they are only playable as one-ofs. Also, some other cards that you might not expect to be restricted are based on the unique texture of the format. So cards like Chalice of the Void that are able to be played as four-ofs in Modern and Legacy are restricted in Vintage. Karn the Great Creator is also restricted in Vintage because many of the decks rely on activated abilities of artifacts, and so Karn winds up being really powerful. And of course, every deck can run Lotus and the Moxen. Strangely enough, Monastery Mentor makes the list of restricted cards, probably because of how many cheap spells there are like the Moxes. Narset is also restricted, as is Mystic Forge. And then other taxing effects like Thorn of Amethyst also restricted. And then Treasure Cruise is an odd case because it's legal in Pioneer but banned in Modern and Legacy, but then it is of course not banned here, but it is only playable as a one-of. Also, Trinisphere is another card that is only playable as a one-of. So some of the pillars of the format are going to be these four categories. So you've got blue decks in all of their varieties. They're mostly Storm-esque combo decks or control decks, but basically this is your pile of sort of just blue value combo and control cards. Then you've got decks that are based around Bazaar of Baghdad because it's an incredible enabler for cards like Dredge Mechanic, for example. You've got Workshop decks, which are all artifact themed, of course. And then finally, the newest addition to the Vintage roster is Initiative. So you've got a bunch of white initiative decks, of mono white initiative, of course, but also various flavors of white and then paired with another color initiative decks. And then there are some cards or some decks that don't fall into any of these four categories, but this is going to be the bulk of the format. And similarly, these approximately 11 decks are going to make up the bulk of the format. Now, that's not to say that you can't play other decks besides these 11, and there are decks that exist outside of them, but these are the main ones. So you've got your blue Tinker decks, you've got Doomsday, you've got Dredge, you've got Grixis combo decks, often involving Underworld Breach. You've got your Hollowvine decks, your Jeskai Control or Jeskai Luris decks, obviously the Initiative. There's Oath of Druids, Paradoxical Outcome decks, various flavors of Mishra's Workshop, usually stacks, but sometimes aggro as well, and then Bug midrange. And in particular, you might notice something, which is that all of these decks are either doing something brokenly degenerate with combos or are various like value control piles. Now, aggro is not really going to be able to be played in Vintage for the most part, although it's arguable whether decks like Dredge and Hollowvine fit into aggro, but at least they're not traditional aggro decks. And there are some, like there are aggro shops, for example, but for the most part, your typical like Burn or other of those sorts of aggro decks are not going to be able to show up in Vintage because combo decks are so fast that aggro decks can't really race them. So with that introduction of Vintage out of the way, let's go ahead and start the marathon.